I raised my hand interrupting the board meeting earlier this month. Last month, I suppose. I've been a rabbi for nearly 17 years, I said. Never have I been involved in a conversation in which we deliberated the possibility of the federal government taking retributive action against the synagogue I serve. What prompted this interjection? The possibility that money already awarded and dispersed to us for security updates to our building could be clawed back by the federal government. And this conversation came about because in order to accept future security grants, recipients must certify that they do not and will not, during the term of this financial assistance award, operate any programs that advance or promote DEI. And although this new policy is in reference to the upcoming cycle, we have all witnessed the federal government's effort to recover funds from universities nationwide. Witnessing the events of the last few months made that board conversation necessary. I hope it goes without saying that we're not changing any inclusion policies at TVU. Our country is in crisis, and of course, so is the Jewish community. Over the last 10 years, we've experienced an upsurge in anti-Semitism that we never imagined might occur here. Since Charlottesville, the rise has come from the extreme political fringe on both sides of the spectrum. We can point to white supremacy in Pittsburgh fueling the massacre at Tree of Life Synagogue, but also to radical progressive ideology in Washington, D.C. with the assassination of 2 Israeli embassy employees. I'll add that one of our very own TBE members, a young woman who grew up here, was at that AJC event. She left about 20 minutes before the attacker took random aim at people who he believed to be Jews. Yes, we are feeling the anxiety of this time, and it's driving us all mad. But we Jews have lived through tempests before, and we have survived. The Talmudic literature shares a story in Tractate Yevamot of a boat blown apart by a storm. Rabban Gamliel, a contemporary of Rabbi Akiva, recounts from his own boat having seen a shipwreck in the distance while traveling. Knowing that Rabbi Akiva had been on board, Gamliel began to grieve. And when Gamliel arrived on dry land, he was surprised and overjoyed to see his friend Akiva. They both sat down and immediately began discussing a matter of law. Gamliel, eventually in shock and disbelief, asked Akiva, "How did you survive the shipwreck? The water, the waves?" And Akiva responded, "I grabbed hold of a plank of floating wood in the water and I held tight until I was washed ashore." A sweet story. But the translation alone doesn't help us understand the deeper meaning it conveys. In the original Talmudic language, the word that's used for plank is daf. And typically a translation of daf would be page, as in a page of Talmud. Akiva was saying to his friend Gamliel, "You know what you do when you're in the midst of a storm? Do you know how to survive the whirlwind and the water? Do you know how to escape drowning as the sea swells and tries to overtake you? Grab hold of your truth, of who you are. Take hold of our sacred message. You can't stop the waves, but you can keep yourself from drowning. You can keep yourself from oblivion." On this Day of Atonement, when we seek to have our names written in the book of life, we must ask ourselves this year, how are we going to stay afloat? How are we going to make it to shore? What kind of country, what kind of democracy are we fighting to preserve? Our survival as Jews in America depends not just on our faith, but in our active participation in preserving the democratic center that has allowed us to flourish. Regardless of one's position on the political spectrum, it's hard not to see that much of the world is on edge. In the international theater, we're moving away from a values-based system of cooperation with allies to a transactional system, rather than asking the question, how can we make the world a more stable and secure place for us all? National leaders are asking, what's in it for us? We've seen this play out in Ukraine and Israel most clearly, but there are other subtle ways this dynamic is shaping a more hostile and unpredictable world. While the international theater is bad enough, I know I'm not alone in fearing what is unfolding here at home. And I know that because many of you have spoken to me over the last several months. I'll add, too, at this moment, I wrote this sermon over really the last few days, and I've had to change it. I've had to change it twice since I wrote it. National Guard troops in Washington, D.C., now headed to Portland and Louisiana, and a threat to use them elsewhere in cities without warranting emergency, an assault on higher education, medicine, and civil rights, masked ICE agents pulling undocumented people off the street with no warrants for arrest and arresting citizens alike. Political assassinations this summer and fall have left us all wondering what happens next. And I believe most critically, a silence of free speech, with major media outlets capitulating to threats from the FCC. And of course, we all know this. Everybody in the room knows these things. This congregation is well informed. But when so much is happening from day to day, when our heads feel like spinning tops ready to fall to the ground, it's time to stop, to breathe, to get our bearings, and eventually to act. But not in the way I imagine many of you are thinking. America has been good for us Jews. In fact, America has been fantastic for us. We would be hard-pressed to find another country in the world today where, as a community, we are as successful, as engaged, and as flourishing. In fact, we would be hard-pressed to find another place like this in the last 2,000 years. But I don't think we appreciate this reality enough. In some cases, for those of us in the room, it was just the generation prior that experienced the degradation our people suffered in Europe. Even ignoring the worst of it, the Holocaust, our people were excluded from civil life, barred from certain industries and professions, and forced to live in certain undesirable areas. Given the considerable freedom we enjoy in the United States, it's sometimes hard to imagine that grandparents and great-grandparents lived extraordinarily different lives from our own. The Jews who came to this land understood the significance of America in ways that I fear we Jews today forget. In the 19th century, the Midwest was as good as the Wild West for most Jews. Joseph Jonas arrived in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1817, and he worshiped alone for 2 years before another Jew arrived in Cincinnati. Eventually, he helped found B'nai Israel in 1824, the oldest synagogue west of the Allegheny Mountains. In 1868, B'nai Israel gathered to lay the cornerstone of their second sanctuary structure, The event was covered by the Cincinnati Enquirer, which noted, on arriving at the temple, the procession consisted of 7 carriages filled with invited guests, including His Honor Mayor Wilstach and distinguished dignitaries of the church, beside about 1,000 citizens on foot. There were multiple bands, and even the founder of the Reform movement in the United States, Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, was there to deliver a prayer at the dedication. After the prayer, a dignitary from the congregation filled a time capsule to be placed in the cornerstone with several important items. The Enquirer lists them in the following order: the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, Washington's farewell address, the Constitution of the State of Ohio, and the bylaws of the congregation. And just think about this remarkable moment. These Jewish pioneers didn't see their American identity and their Jewish identity as separate. They were inextricably linked. The founding documents of our nation were as sacred to them as their own congregational covenant and were placed in the time capsule. They understood that the Constitution that protected their right to worship was an essential aspect, essential to their Jewish future. It was as essential to the Jewish future as their prayer books. The American ship we find ourselves on today is in distress. And like Akiva reaching for his daf, his plank of Jewish tradition to keep him afloat, we too must buoy ourselves not only with Jewish sacred texts, but with American sacred documents. It's so hard for some of us to imagine how deeply connected Jews felt to their Americanness in earlier years. For those of us born here, I imagine many of us take our citizenship for granted. In immigrating to the United States, Jews literally were escaping Europe, whether from pogroms, institutionalized anti-Semitism, or simply to remove the heavy boot of economic and civic repression. Now, of course, this isn't everyone's story. Not all of us are of Ashkenazi descent, not all of us have Jewish ancestry, and not all of us here today are even technically Jewish. But all of us have attached ourselves to the Jewish story in America, and collective stories in Judaism become our stories even when they haven't been our stories. America offered our forebears opportunities they could scarcely imagine. As Ferdinand Isserman, an early 20th century American Reform rabbi and scholar, notes, the United States is the only nation in the world which, from the moment of its birth, gave the Jew all the rights and privileges of citizenship, placed him upon a par of equality with his neighbor, and recognized him as an integral and essential part of the nation. Yes, America is different. And it has been for us since Jews first arrived here. Our democracy under siege should concern all Americans, but it should concern us more because of our history of acceptance and safety in the United States. In bygone ages, we lived among strong men, kings, and rulers who sometimes saw the usefulness of Jews in their country. Jewish leaders would do their best to get close to power, to make the Jewish community indispensable, but eventually, when that king died or some travesty befell the country, the Jews who were associated with the ruler would be targeted. They had to rely on these strong men because it was all they had. There was no constitution. There was no Bill of Rights. Our endangered democracy and transactional leadership are not engendering an America in which Jews are safe. We've lived in places like that before. We do not want to go back. I was recently speaking with a longtime national Jewish communal leader about the political situation over the last few years. And he said to me, "You know, Josh, I'm concerned that most Jews won't have a political home 10 years from now. Either extreme on the political spectrum ultimately leads us to places in which the future of the Jewish community is at risk. It is not Democrats or Republicans that we should be troubled by. It is radical elements in each of those parties that jeopardize the future of our faltering democracy. In 1994, the political philosopher Isaiah Berlin aptly warned of this danger in a speech read on his behalf at the University of Toronto. Berlin warned that extremism, whether left or right, begins with the dangerous belief that complex problems have simple solutions. When people become convinced they alone possess the truth, they justify any means to achieve their ends. Only the stupid and malevolent will resist, they think. This thinking leads inevitably to what Berlin called a terrible progression. Those who resist must be persuaded. If they cannot be persuaded, laws must be passed to restrain them. If that does not work, then coercion, if need be, violence will inevitably have to be used. If necessary, terror, slaughter. Berlin tells us a truth that we should hear if we want to save our democracy. He writes, "Men have always craved for liberty, security, equality, happiness, justice, knowledge, and so on. But complete liberty is not compatible with complete equality. If men were wholly free, the wolves would be free to eat the sheep. Security, and indeed freedoms, cannot be preserved if freedom to subvert them is permitted." And while that dictate, making sure that freedom to subvert them is not permitted is one that we must stand by, we also know that democracy requires compromise. Arguably, it is the most essential element of democracy. Hearing voices we disagree with and governing with people who see the world differently make us stronger. It helps. It has been the strength of our nation for so long. We live in an age of uncertainty, yet most of the political rhetoric we hear is phrased in absolutes. Compromise has been all but extinguished in the political world. But for us Jews, compromise has been a central component to thriving in America, because it takes compromise to hear a voice you disagree with. It takes compromise to fully embrace a person outside of one's perceived group. It takes compromise to govern with people who see the world differently. If there's anything we've learned as Jews over the last few hundred years in America, it is that we thrive in liberal democracy. We thrive in a place that values diversity, a place that values unobstructed voices, a place that values civic engagement. Last night, I spoke of the need for more varied voices in our own congregation, the need for diversity of opinion. And I brought Hillel and Shammai as the quintessential example in our tradition of righteous disagreement. The Talmud tells us that even after 3 long years of disagreement between these two schools, a final ruling could not be made on a legal matter, and eventually God steps in, declaring both these and those are the words of the living God. For thousands of years, our tradition has recognized that no single human being, no single school of thought or political party has all of the answers. To believe that is idolatrous. And when we recognize that we don't possess an exclusive truth, we might relent and find that compromise is possible, that compromise is desirable, that compromise is sacred. Yes, we've thrived in the liberal democracy of America, and all of us, those who are already engaged politically and those who have refrained from political engagement, all of us, for the sake of Jews in America and for the sake of America itself, must deepen our involvement in civic life. And while I call for deeper involvement, it is also imperative that however we involve ourselves in civic and political life, we look for opportunities to tone down rhetoric. We help our community here and in Michigan and throughout this great nation move away from voices of division, move away from the extreme, the radical end of either party that pushes us towards calamity rather than calm. So what does this mean for us here now on this Day of Atonement? I'm aware that there are many members of our congregation who are already deeply involved in political life. Those of you who have the ear of local, state, and national politicians, use your influence. Speak to those in power, even if they are in the minority party right now. Encourage them to come toward the middle if they are not already there. Tell them that inflammatory words stoke dangerous fires. More than speaking with politicians, making donations, and engaging in other forms of advocacy, run for office. It isn't enough to rely on others to ensure that we are safe in America, that we are safe in Michigan, in Ann Arbor. Run for school board, where our children's education is shaped. Run for city council, where our community's futures are decided. Run for the library board, where intellectual freedom is defended. We need more of you in office, more voices of reason in rooms where decisions are made. I envision an America where Jewish voices help bridge divides, where our historical experience with persecution makes us natural advocates for other marginalized communities, where our tradition of debate and questioning strengthens democratic discourse rather than polarizes it. Yes, we Jews need to get back to creating America. So many of us have gotten caught up in partisan politics that we've forgotten what makes America different, what makes America a place of possibility for so many. We must reinvest in the dream of America, in the inspiration of America, in the possibility that America can fulfill its own sacred mythology. As we prepare to close this Day of Atonement, as we prepare to have our names sealed in the book of life, let us commit not just to being written in that sacred book, but to writing the next chapter of American democracy, to rebuild an American ship that can withstand the heavy gales of the 21st century. In our time of distress, we must hold tight to our sacred texts, centering ourselves in our Jewishness and our Americanness. That is the daf, the plank, that will keep us afloat as we come ashore to a new age in America. Let us be a generation that chose engagement over retreat, moderation over extremism, hope over fear. For we are the children of those who place the Constitution alongside our sacred texts. A reminder that our American story and our Jewish story are inextricably linked. May we prove worthy of both inheritances.